Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first senior seminar class discussion of the 2019-2020 school year. My name is Dr. Shawn H. Williams. I'm the Associate and Lead Professor of Political Science here at Campbellsville University. And welcome back. If you've been following our series for the last several years, the way this works is we have a senior seminar class that gets together and over the course of the semester talks about some of the most important events, political or otherwise, as they relate to the American, comparative, international, and political theories realms of political science. Today I have our three senior seminar students joining us. I have Tanner Cahoe. Tanner, how are you doing today?
Doing great, how are you?
Doing very well. Ms. Danielle Dickens.
Danielle Manning.
Danielle Manning, I apologize.
That's okay.
Yeah. Danielle got married over a year ago, and it still says Danielle Dickens on her Skype, and I was just reading it. My apologies. And Rebeca Scurt. Rebecca, how are you doing today?
I'm good, thank you.
Fantastic. So today, our topic of conversation is the trade conflict between the United States and China. But more specifically, what we're really going to be talking about is how this trade conflict is going to be impacting the re-election bid of our current president, Donald Trump. If you open up the news today, obviously the trade war is going to be one of the hot topics. We have headlines everywhere from asking whether or not the current slide in the manufacture or the farming sector is going to be a problem for Donald Trump. Over at Market Watch, there's an argument that's being made that Trump really doesn't actually care about the trade war. What he cares about is re-election. And if he feels like that making a trade deal with China isn't going to help his re-election, he's just going to kind of dump it. Of course, CNN, ever the anti-Trump station that it is, their argument is that really Americans haven't started feeling the burden of Trump's tariffs. And because they haven't, then they're probably not really thinking clearly about how the trade war is going to impact their view of Trump in the upcoming election. So here's what we're going to do. We're just going to talk about a little bit about what we're seeing and what we're feeling in the world today. And I guess starting off with you guys, for viewers who may not know a lot about what's going on, if someone would just jump in and provide some background information about the trade war.
All right, so I guess I can start. This really started, if you look at it, in June of 2016, whenever Trump was still in his campaign. Not June 2016, June of 2015, I think it may have been, but Trump was still in his campaign, and he brought up some of the trade war and some of the trade crisis with China, basically saying that they're treating us unfair and that America is losing money, especially in their economic sense, to China. And at that point, nobody really realized that Trump was going to be the president of the United States, and no one really thought that he was. But now here we are. He's added tariffs recently. I think the first tariff may have been about a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago. And currently they're working on some trade talks. And if a trade talk will happen between now and 2020, we'll see. Trump currently believes that it doesn't have to for him to get re-elected, which we'll talk about later. And last thing I heard, they were going to meet this month for some more trade talks. So we'll see how that goes.
Do you, either of you ladies have anything to add?
I think that sums it up pretty well.
So one quick question before we get deeper into Trump's position on this. There's been this back and forth between, as you mentioned, Mr. Cahoe, back and forth between the United States and China, where we've been trading higher and higher tariffs. Now, the United States and China, we're part of several international trade organizations like the WTO. Have they weighed in yet? Have they tried to do anything to either block tariffs from being implemented or to voice an opinion on that?
Well, I think they're still working on it. And that's why, Trump argues that it doesn't do a really good job in settling down the issue and in making sure that both sides are in peace with each other. So that's what I'm trying to argue for, that if Trump withdraws he has a reason for it. And but according to what's going on right now, they believe that the World Trade Organization is really trying hard to make things better between China and the United States.
So bringing it back a little more domestically then. So the WTO is kind of on the sidelines of this. I guess that makes sense when the two biggest economies in the world are fighting it out. The WTO is probably just going to let it happen. But turning domestically, what do you guys think? Do you think that the American people are paying attention to what's happening in this trade war with China? Do you think that we largely are focusing our attention somewhere else? Are there conditions under which we might pay attention to it more and it might have an impact? Where do you guys come down on this?
I think there are conditions where American people would definitely start paying attention. But in terms of the 2020 election, I think that's going to be much more of a social issue campaign and election season. And if this continues to escalate, it would be something that more people would pay attention to, but I'm not sure it's going to be the hot button issue in this upcoming election.
Are there any social issues that you think are more front burner issues for the American people? Are there specific things that maybe if Congress acted and solved a policy problem, that those issues might go away? Or do you think it's just in general, right now we're in a domestic mindset?
I think it's just currently that we're in a domestic mindset. I mean, I think the most hot button issues are going to be things like abortion and gun control, like they have over the last few years.
Yes, and immigration is probably going to be pretty big.
Immigration as well.
Yeah, but I think that Tanner made a really good argument that if the Democrats may bring it up and will make it really will make it known to the public what's going on between America and China and focus so much on it, then it can become an issue, like a social one.
What do you think the probability of that happening is? Do you think that the Democratic Party in general or any of the specific candidates are particularly focused on trade as an issue?
I mentioned it in my paper a little bit. I think it really depends on who the nominee is. If you're looking at Joe Biden, I think he's really likely to bring it up. With his stances on free trade and things like that. But Elizabeth Warren, for example, may be more apt not to say anything about it for the main fact that her and Trump actually agree a lot on how to solve this problem with China. I think it was Jim Cramer, one of Trump's spokespersons, that even said that President Warren would be tougher on trade than President Trump is currently.
So in that sense, Warren might have a little bit of leverage then in terms of making the argument. So from your analysis then, it sounds like you're thinking that Biden and Warren are the top two candidates in the Democratic nomination. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, for sure. You're starting to see now where a lot of Bernie supporters are starting to shift over to a Warren nominee.
And for viewers who are watching at home, we were recording this video the day after Bernie Sanders has had some arterial stents inserted. And so we're still waiting a little bit to make sure, or of course, prayerful that he will be okay. But certainly if you're in the middle of a presidential campaign and you have to have a relatively major surgical procedure performed, voters and inside the Beltway politicos are probably going to be looking at your campaign a little bit differently than they would have for Mr. Sanders about 3 or 4 days ago. What about the other two? Do you feel like that Biden and Warren are the two front-running candidates in the same way that Mr. Cahoe does?
I think that's a pretty fair statement. I don't think anybody else is really going to pull ahead as much as they have with name recognition and that type of thing.
Yeah, I believe the same thing too. They've both been very they have gathered a lot of support from so many different groups of people and minorities, and they've had an impact on this election a lot more than the other candidates.
And it certainly seems, as Cahoe mentioned, Mr. Cahoe mentioned that Warren's numbers appear to be improving, whereas some of the other top tier candidates like Kamala Harris, their numbers appear to be softening. So coming back to this question of domestic versus international trade issues. So you identified the top 2 or 3 issues that you think are possibly going to impact the election. Why do you feel that domestic issues are kind of dominating this election? Is this just something that's true about the American people in general? Are we just domestically focused? Or is there a particular period in American history where international affairs just aren't as important to us?
I think relatively recently in the past, just as a country, we have been focused more on domestic issues, but particularly with this election cycle, it's also just like more people care about what's happening here than anywhere else, because we were kind of living through an unprecedented political climate. So I think we're a lot more focused on what's going to happen here as opposed to internationally.
Yeah, in my paper, I kind of argued the same thing, that most voters who want to vote for someone, they have more knowledge about the president based on what he did in the country, and since their interests are more about how can I get a better life, like things that surround them, then they will basically prioritize domestic issues instead of international ones. It also depends on how much they know about foreign issues. Like now, more and more people talk about what's going on outside the United States and about free trade. And I think people now are starting to realize the impact that China or other countries can have on domestic resources in the United States and on the economy as a whole. So, but before, people were just more aware of what's going on in their city, in their state.
That's an interesting argument that you make, Ms. Scurt, and it's actually one of the reasons why I wanted to open talking about the CNN article. There's the sense that among people who, admittedly, people who are sort of in the anti-Trump camp, right? So let's keep that in mind. But what a lot of anti-Trumpers are arguing is that the average American hasn't felt the pressure of the trade war, and that most of the people who have felt the pressure, people who are farmers, people who are ranchers, people who are relatively wealthy importer exporters, these are mostly in the Trump camp. However, CNN's argument, what they're anticipating is that Americans are going to start feeling the domestic impact of the trade war. Do you buy that argument? I mean, do you feel that there is a real domestic blowback we're going to experience? Do you think if prices started to rise at Walmart, the average American would change their opinion and pay more attention to the international issues?
I think it's possible, but President Trump's opponent in 2020, whoever that may be, for them to have a positive influence on this, they're going to have to make the connection between the China trade deal and the economy. They're going to have to make that connection to the people. And I think once the people see that connection, it can hurt Trump. I don't know if it can hurt him enough to keep him from getting reelected, because I think the domestic issues can still take over. But I think it can hurt him, to say the least.
I think that's also like relying on the intelligence of the average American consumer to put those things together. And I'm not sure how likely that is. I think it would have to be a pretty significant impact for the average person to like feel that impact. As Becky said, like the average voter is going to choose who they're going to vote for based on how their surroundings have changed for the better or worse. And the China trade deal might not necessarily impact them in their small circle enough to really change one way or another.
Yeah, I think that right now we are just at the beginning of this trade war, so we don't really know exactly how far it is going to go, and that's why I believe that Trump is doing a good job in like making people aware of like what an impact China can have on the economy. And But right now, we don't really see how big of an impact it has on domestic issues. So we will have to wait in the future and talk about it later.
It's almost, I guess, like the argument they're having in UK with Brexit, right? Like there are all these, the sky is going to fall in if you vote exit. Everything bad's going to happen. The world's going to collapse. And none of that's really happened in UK. But then again, it's because the impact of Brexit hasn't really started to be felt. And I guess maybe the same thing is possible here in the United States. So to follow up on something that Ms. Manning said a second ago, I guess you're right. There does have to be a certain level of sophistication among a voter to be able to make this connection. Is it that you think that the average American voter lacks the sophistication, or is it that you just think that they're too distracted by everything else that's going on in the world?
A little bit of both.
Okay.
I think by the time the effects of the China trade deal trickle down to the average American consumer, it might not be a significant enough price increase for people to either care or notice.
Mm.
But I think the greatest impact, like the people that will be most impacted and will be the people that live in those rich states. That's what I believe, because they basically have more knowledge. They are indirectly involved with what's going on internationally, because so many people from so many different countries live in those areas and they have to deal with those problems. So that's what I believe.
Yeah, that could be an interesting argument if you look at the people that are already going to vote Democrat, if they're already if they're the only ones that are going to make this connection, or if it will trickle down to the people that are moderates or Republicans.
So if always Trump voters and never Trump voters are impacted, you're saying the election, it sounds like Ms. Scurt and Mr. Cahoe, you're both making this argument. If they're the only ones who are impacted, then the election doesn't change. It's only if kind of independent or swing voters are impacted that you think that this is going to matter.
Right. You would think that the always Trumpers and the never Trumpers are always going to stay in that camp no matter what happens, really. It would take something really drastic, I think a lot more drastic than the China trade deal to change their minds on how they vote.
That's an interesting point about, I wonder how many people who plan on voting have already made up their mind one way or another, because I think in this election, a lot of people have already made up their mind.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure how much the China trade deal would affect that if people have already formed opinions about who they're going to vote for.
So I want to take an argument that Donald Trump himself made in a different context. Donald Trump made this argument a few years ago that if the Republicans didn't cut taxes, the American people would punish the Republicans because that was one of their key campaign promises. So if I think back to the Trump election, there are actually these memes of the number of times the word China appeared in Trump rallies. So if I understand your argument correctly, you don't think that the American people will hold Trump accountable for that promise in the same way that they do, say, immigration or tax cuts. Is that also fair?
I would agree with that.
Is there any evidence to suggest that voters would think differently about a trade deal with China than over other key campaign promises?
I think it's really the fact that he's calling out China. I think just that his voters care more about I think his voters care more about that he's calling out China than actually the complex of the issue.
Okay, so it's the symbolism of the confrontation that's more important than maybe the actual outcome. So then turning back to the question we started with, the research question that we've been motivated by for this last couple of weeks of research has been asking if the president had to make a significant change in trade relations with China, and if he failed to do so, would he be held accountable? Do you think it's possible if the president were to just simply say, okay, we're not going to make any changes to the trade deal, we're just going to go back to the status quo, would the American people pay attention then because he failed to negotiate a deal, or is just simply not being worse off what's going to motivate their behavior? What do you think?
I think that could tie into Tanner's argument that if he did fail to make a significant change. Perhaps his opponents could use that against him and say it made him weak.
Do you think that
I'm not sure the American people would really change their opinion. I don't think like strong Trump supporters would necessarily use that against him or really take that as a reason not to vote for him.
Ms. Scurt, I think you were trying to jump in a second ago.
I wanted to say that right now, like, I think before you've pull out a source saying that Trump right now focuses, or most candidates mostly focus on like domestic issues or try to talk less about what's going on outside the country. And I think that's what he's focusing mostly on his re-election. And even if they have this dispute going on, I would not consider it a war, even if tariffs have increased and things started to look badly. I don't think they will end badly, because they are still, if he will be re-elected, I think they will be able to negotiate a good and fair trade deal.
So I guess it sounds like you think, Ms. Scurt, that to make sure I understood you correctly, you think that there will be some kind of a trade deal between the United States and China. It may not happen before the election, though, or do you think that we will be before the election?
I think it will be after, like clearly putting it on paper, it will be after.
Okay, so not enough time left. How about the rest of you guys? Do you feel like there will be some kind of a positive resolution where America ends up better off, and do you think it'll happen before the current election?
I don't really think it will happen before the current election in terms of a final positive deal. I think President Trump, if he really wanted to, could push it off until after the election so as not to lose voters based on whatever outcome happens.
Yeah, Danielle made a really good point in her paper where, I have actually a quote written down here. She said, failing to make significant changes is not necessarily failing outright. And it's a really good point. If Trump can kind of divert the issue for the next 13 months and bring less attention to it, he can focus on it more between 2024 if he's reelected, and not worry about reelection and the consequences of it.
And I guess some might even argue that there's a case to be made that having the issue left out there might give him a campaign platform. Like, you look at all the great things that I have accomplished. I haven't had a chance to finish it all. Give me 4 more years and I will finish the job, which is something that presidents, I think, tend to do. So looking forward then, I'm going to ask you guys to do what, as a political scientist, I try never to do. We have a couple of minutes left in the broadcast. Looking forward, it seems like none of you think that there's going to be an end to the trade negotiations before the end of the election. It sounds like all 3 of you feel like that unless something unforeseen happens, like the economy collapses, similar to what happened in 2008, right before the election, you don't think that the trade deal is going to matter. Looking forward, how do you feel then about Trump's re-election chances? Do you feel like this perspective is also true with a number of other issues? He's basically okay, or do you think that there are some issues out there on the horizon that could be a real problem for Trump?
I don't necessarily think that a trade deal won't happen before the 2020 election. I think it probably shouldn't for his re-election chances. But like, as I said in my paper, President Trump is very unpredictable, and if he just makes up his mind and decides that he does want to come to a conclusion with that deal before the 2020 election, who's to say that's not going to happen? So I think that's possible, probably won't happen, but still not completely off the table for him.
Okay, and but nonetheless, is there something else that's out there, another issue that you think that Trump is going to have a stumbling block over, or do you feel like his chances for re-election right now are pretty solid?
I think there's going to be several issues that he'll have a stumbling block over just with the American people. I'm not sure if that's going to keep him from being reelected, but there's definitely going to be issues that the American people have with his presidency. Okay.
Ms. Scurt, what do you think?
I'm thinking a lot about a lot of things, but yeah, a lot of things have been happening since Trump has been elected, and some say it has been bad, and violence has increased, and others say he has done so much. And it's like Danielle said, he's unpredictable, and I feel like over the past 4 years, people have gotten used to him, to Trump, and they don't have too many expectations like they've had before. And right now with his re-election, they're just considering other candidates and look at other people who try to argue against him, but they haven't really been able to pull out a lot of negative things from his past. And they're still trying to and accusing him and trying to impeach him. And but I don't think that this will really have a great impact on his re-election. And yeah, so I think he's on the right track right now with him pushing for things such as the economy and people and jobs, and all this are becoming more and more of an important issues to Americans, because that's what they have to deal with every day. And so
back in 1980, we often go back to the Ronald Reagan presidency of 1980, his election in 1980, as the way that you compare all later campaigns. And so to your point, Ms. Scurt, he made the argument, like he went around asking the question, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And it sounds like you're saying the average American is better off, and the China deal isn't, or the China trade conflict hasn't made them worse off. And so those are probably more important. Okay, Mr. Cahoe, you're going to get the final word on the matter.
So like Danielle said, I mean, does Trump have those stumbling blocks? Yes, he does, and every political candidate does. And I like her point she made in her paper, where if he can divert on the issue, on the China trade issue, for the next 13 months, that can help him in 2020 by focusing on more domestic issues. Overall, I don't think Trump's re-election chances are going to be much harmed from the China trade deal. And if he can make a significant change to the China trade deal between now and 2020, even if he could, I'm not for sure that he would do it. Because if he does do it, I mean, then people can focus on the pros of the deal, the cons of the deal. And if there are many cons of the deal he made, that can hurt him more than it helps him.
So a only slightly better deal may actually be worse than a no deal for Donald Trump.
For sure. Like I said, in 2020, if he can work on a deal between 2020 and 2024 and divert towards other attentions, then in 2020 and 2024, he can focus more on making the deal that he wants and not worry about the consequences of it when it comes to re-election.
Well, I guess that's where we're going to have to leave it there. We are just about out of time. Thank you, everybody who has watched this video. And if after you have watched the entire thing, you would like to provide us some comments, please leave some feedback, either about the class, about the question, or maybe about the comments of the panelists. And also check out some of the other videos we're going to be posting this year, especially our analysis, our election night analysis, where we're going to be discussing a couple of days after the election, the outcome of the Kentucky statewide races, including the governor and the attorney general's office. In the meantime, my name is Shawn Williams, and I thank you very much for joining me.